Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. Well, the way a lot of us have found connection to the Civil War is by looking at photos that existed from then, because the Civil War is really the first American conflict where we have photography widely available. But we look at different photos and say, well, why do they all look a little bit different? Well, we're in Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin Dells, at the H. Bennett Photographic Studio and Historic Site, and their manager, Dave Rambow, who is both the manager here and a longtime wet plate photographer himself, is going to walk us through the different processes that we find here. So, Dave, go ahead and tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here and where the differences are.
We have laid out here just a small cross-section of some of the more popular styles of photography used prior and during the American Civil War. The oldest that we have, and one of the first, actually the first proper type of photography, was called the Daguerreotype, and it was invented and marketed by a Frenchman named Louis Daguerre. He discovered this process in 1839. The country of France thought it's such an amazing technological discovery to be able to capture a permanent image that they awarded him a salary for life. It is a metal plate covered with silver, and you have to step it through several different chemicals to make it work properly. The sensitivity of the plate was somewhat lacking, so if you were, as a subject or a victim, as sometimes they were called, were asked to sit for one of these portraits indoors, it might be a minute or two that you'd have to sit immobilized. If you could pull that off and do that, they're some of the most beautiful and sharp images yet today.
Wow. So you say photograph indoors. Did Daguerre do any work outdoors?
There were some daguerreotypes done in Paris in the early years where they would actually just point the camera out a window of a second-story building. The streets of Paris are always bustling. I hear it never sleeps. Unfortunately, the slowness of that film could not pick up the movement, and what they ended up with the plate was, it looks like a picture devoid of traffic except for one guy who was having his boots shined in the street.
Fantastic. Well, let's leave France and let's move closer to the Civil War. Daguerre is doing the daguerreotypes. What's next?
In 1851, a scientist named Frederick Scott Archer discovered a process where if you dip a plate in a solution of silver nitrate, it would collect as an emulsion on that plate. Archer was not a photographer or an artist. He was a scientist. He wrote this up in a scientific journal and gave it free to the world.
Well, let me stop you for a second. Obviously, being motion picture old enough to be back shooting film, I know what emulsion is. Can you give us a layman's term of what the emulsion is in the photographic process?
Okay. At our time during the American Civil War, emulsion was a thin layer that was poured across the plate that would then be sensitized to be light sensitive. So when the light hit it, it would absorb or be able to accept an image.
So the emulsion is actually what's going to create the image that
Right.
we see on whatever medium, whether it's glass or whether it's metal.
Correct. So Archer, in his wonderfulness, gave this to the world. The Americans, as others in all other countries, picked up the process, started doing it themselves. By the start of the American Civil War in 1860, it's estimated there were 10,000 photographers in this country alone.
Wow. And you see a couple of processes here that come out of Archer's work. What do we see here in the processes?
Well, the most common would be the earlier one, the Ambrotype, which is a positive image on a piece of glass. And those could be done in many, many different sizes. The largest being a whole plate, which was 6.5 by 8.5 inches. A half plate, half of that, and geometrically smaller as we go. These usually were put in cases. Since they were on glass, they were very fragile. The interesting thing about an Ambrotype, it's actually just an underdeveloped negative. So if you hold that glass plate up to light after it's been made, it looks like a negative. But if you add a contrasting color to the back of it, the image looks like a positive. The later and next process, which is a truly American process that was really started in 1856, was what was called at that time the Ferrotype or Melainotype. And that today, of course, we know as the Tintype. It was on a much more durable substrate, a piece of iron. The emulsion poured across the top. And it was like so much more durable. It didn't have to be in a case, although some of the earliers were.
Well, time out. You said it's on a piece of iron, but you called it a tintype.
Uh-oh.
What happens?
Well, the word tin sometimes I've heard in those days meant cheap. So this was a cheaper process. Some people, they say, called it Tintype because it was a cheaper version. Another, and I think more plausible reason for them people calling it tintypes is oftentimes you could make a block of these on one plate, and the easiest way to carve that iron plate into the subsequent smaller things, it would be to use a pair of tin snips and do it that way.
Back then, what was replication like?
Replication was painful, if even able to be done. If I have one of these tintypes, which, by the way, this piece of metal on these was actually in the camera, in the room, with the person who this was made of. So this is as close as we're ever going to get to a time machine right now. Say you, as the sitter, wanted your image struck, but your buddies or your wife or your best girl wanted a copy as well. You couldn't just hand that around to everybody. If you wanted another one made, you'd have to do a second sitting, which means more block of your time and it cost a little more money. So what photographers did in that case is oftentimes they'd have a camera which was fitted with 4 or 6 or even 8 or 12 lenses. You would take that same image with that same camera several times and you would end up with a smaller block of the same basic image duplicated.
So like this young child that we have 3 of the 4, that camera could have taken that image, taken 4,
Oh, yes.
and then you cut it up.
Right.
So Dave, I see a lot of substance here that we've talked about that are durable or at least hard to carry, whether it's metal, whether it's copper, whether it's iron that we're going to call tin. And then I look over here and we see cardstock. What is this and how do we get from here to there?
This third and I think the ultimate invention of wet plate photography was what was called in its day the carte de visite, which is French for visiting card. It was about the size of a card. When you would visit friends or family, you would leave to announce your arrival. These could be easily made using a glass plate negative. They were printed on paper, and that paper then could be glued to a thin cardstock, which would be marked with the maker's name on the back. The beauty of this is since they could be duplicated in infinity, you could make hundreds and hundreds and thousands of the same image if desired.
Which isn't such a big deal for Private Joe Smith from Kilburn City, Wisconsin, but when you're talking Abraham Lincoln and his son reading, there's a lot more demand.
Right. And the volume of these, photographers could crank these out at $1 a dozen, or maybe even more if they were in a bidding war with a competitor in town. So it was a very popular medium. Queen Victoria kind of started what they called cardomania in 1861. She had her portrait struck, and of course England went mad trying to get portraits of the royal family. And that frenzy ended up over here in America about a year later.
My study of Civil War Christmas tradition says that anything Queen Victoria is going to do is going to be a rage in England, and about a year later will be a rage here in America. So I see a box here. What am I looking at, the wooden box?
Well, the box is actually a print frame, and what that contains underneath the glass top is a glass plate negative. Underneath that negative you would squeeze in a piece of flat, light-sensitive photo paper. That box, after that had been all put together, could be taken out, exposed in the average sunlight, and for about 2 minutes, I would guess. And then you would take the paper out, develop it, print it, put it on a piece of, glue it on a piece of cardboard. Then you could make as many copies from that same negative as you desired.
So really, that's almost a CDV photocopier there.
Pretty much, yes.
Great. Well, Dave, thank you for taking your time and sharing a bunch of your collection, both some images that you've taken and some original images, to help us understand the process from Daguerre's first work to the CDVs through the Civil War. Any of these are photographic processes you may see whether looking at originals or looking to have reproductions done. Thank you for spending your time with us at Civil War Digital Digest. We appreciate you committing the time, and we want to say thank you to the patrons who are making more of these trips as we travel further and further to find a Civil War connection possible.